This is episode 118 of the Death to Tyrants podcast. Hey guys, let me tell you about the sponsor for today's show, and that is Lorenzotti Coffee. Oh my goodness, it is so damn good. I kid you not, I found myself the last few mornings waking up earlier than normal just because I'm so excited to drink this coffee that the guys sent me. It is so good. Let me tell you about them really quick. They basically import coffee from a roaster in Naples. Well, now they've got it on their website. You can order it. It is so damn good. They've got ground, whole bean, anything you like over there. And trust me, you won't be disappointed. I do it in the French press. That's how I make my coffee every morning. And I'm so stoked to have these guys as a sponsor. They love liberty. They love the Death to Tyrants podcast. And so we should support them, right? We want the good people to get our money. And when you go over to lorenzotti.coffee, that's LORENZOTTI.coffee, and you use our promo code at checkout, DTTP, for the Death to Tyrants podcast, you get 10% off your order. And they are not expensive, guys, but boy, it tastes expensive. You will not be disappointed. Our sponsor, Lorenzotti Coffee, LORENZOTTI.coffee. Go check them out and use promo code DTTP at checkout. Let's get to the show.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram wrath. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquids, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Death to Tyrants podcast. As always, I am still your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Austin, Texas, where I will continue this little series we've been doing on the culture wars here in America. And I reached out to a man that's been a guest a few times here on the Death to Tyrants podcast, and that is the great Paul Gottfried. And he's always good on this stuff. It actually caught my eye. I subscribe to Chronicles Magazine, where Mr. Gottfried is the editor-in-chief, and he wrote a very good article called Antifa, Nazis Without a Plan. Now, you know, to hear the word Nazi in this day and age, especially in political discussions, which obviously that's where it is mostly, you kind of roll your eyes and go, okay, yeah, it's someone to the right of Elizabeth Warren, and they're a Nazi. But this was actually a pretty good in-depth article by Mr. Gottfried. And if anyone knows the history of Antifa and the history of fascism, both, it is Dr. Paul Gottfried. He just finished a book on the history of anti-fascism, and he's already got a great book out on the history of fascism. So when he says, look, there are some similarities between Antifa and the Nazis, then I listen. I actually pay attention because he does know what he's talking about. It's an interesting article. We bring up multiple points throughout it. He starts it with just saying the anti-fascist left resembles the Nazis in a striking way, particularly when these earlier advocates of violence were on their way to power. Political movements often imitate those that they purport to stand in opposition to. So I think you will find this discussion interesting. We go further than just that particular topic. We get into Black Lives Matter, the progressive left, what's going on with the culture wars. I, of course, have to ask him about the right, the populist right. Dr. Paul Gottfried is a very famous paleo-conservative. And so we talk about that and paleo-libertarianism as well. I even throw in a question about Tucker Carlson. So I think you guys will enjoy this interview with the great Dr. Paul Gottfried. He's an American paleo-conservative philosopher, historian, and columnist. He is a former Horace Raffensperger professor of humanities at Elizabethtown College in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, as well as a Guggenheim Fellowship recipient. He is current president of the H.L. Mencken Club and, like I said, editor-in-chief of Chronicles Magazine. Dr. Paul Gottfried, thank you for being here once again. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for inviting me again.
Yes, sir. I haven't spoken with you since you released the great book, The Vanishing tradition. So I guess before we get into the weeds on the topic at hand today, can you give my listeners a quick overview of that book that just was released? And I want to get into the book that you've been working on lately as well.
Yeah. Well, both are finished. The book on anti-fascism is now with Cornell University Press. The Vanishing Tradition came out over a month ago. It has been getting a lot of Facebook and Twitter attention. I hope it also gets some reviews. The book consists of essays, all of which are critical of what we could call, Con Inc. or Conservatism Incorporated, the conservative establishment. But the essays come to their critical or have critical perspectives about different things. We have essays on foreign policy. We have one essay, which I think is very good, on Catholic neoconservatives who seem to have come and gone. They were necessary for the neoconservatives as a front organization at a particular time. When they lost their value, they pretty much disappear. There's one essay by Jack Kerwick, who's a professor of philosophy, making fun of what he calls the big con. It's a kind of double entendre. It refers not only to the big conservative movement, but it's also a big con because they pretend to be conservative. There's nothing conservative that they really believe in, except maintaining power and serving their sponsors. We have one essay on the defense industry and mostly Heritage Foundation. We have essays on the English Tory tradition, how it's different from neoconservative conservatism. We have at least two essays, if I remember, on the importance of the neoconservatives destroying the reputation and ruining the professional career of Mel Bradford, why they did this.
Mm-hmm.
I have a long essay. Actually, I have two essays, the introductory one and the concluding essay on the history of conservative purges since the 1950s. It sort of starts with the purging of libertarians and end with the purging of whoever they decide to purge now as a right-wing deviationist. I didn't get Michelle Malkin was not purged when I wrote this. And she enjoys the book, but she tells me that I should have waited a little bit longer until she got purged. There was some discussion of my being purged and what it meant. And the argument that I'm making is that whoever they decide to purge, usually with support from left liberal friends with whom they're trying to form alliances, that person becomes an anti-Semite or racist, an extremist, whatever they want to, whatever the left wants to call its enemies. And that person is not only canceled, to use the current phrase, not only a person loses professional contacts, but the conservative establishment has always gone out of its way to destroy these people afterwards. Now, this rarely happens because people deviate toward the left, unless those who deviate toward the left cease to identify with the conservative movement, as the case of Bill Kristol, although one suspects they would welcome him back, if he has second thoughts. But anyone who deviates to the right, who does not have sufficient influence with the movement, is destroyed. So if you decide, I don't like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and you write against it, for most Con Inc. members, it's deadly. Now, I've noticed that Christopher Caldwell got away with this, but then, he's Robert Novak's son, is well connected, was a senior editor at Weekly Standard. So if you have enough connections, you're allowed to say critical things about positions that the conservative movement is supposed to. You would not be allowed, for instance, to criticize Martin Luther King, no matter, because he is probably not even John Lewis. But, you are allowed to write a book that's critical of 64 Civil Rights Act. And you can even get away with discussing cognitive differences among races if you have as much influence as Charles Murray. Obviously, you cannot do this if you're John Derbyshire or somebody, lower in the pecking order, the conservative movement pecking order. I don't think he's even in that pecking order anymore. Now, one of the things I'm arguing in this book is that the purges for the conservative movement are as determinative as purges in the Communist Party. But for some reason, they don't discuss this. I also, find it interesting that Con Inc. is running around attacking the left for cancel culture when they've been practicing cancel culture for decades. before the left began doing this. I mean, to me, this is sheer hypocrisy. As one of the victims of conservative cancel culture, I actually find this amusing. There's a Yiddish phrase, chutzpah, a kind of cheek or audacity. This is the ultimate chutzpah, hypocrisy, that these people would even dare to complain about what the left is doing, sort of given their record of canceling other people, which I tried to bring out in my essay. Now, the other book that I finished writing is on anti-fascism, which discusses the evolution of anti-fascism from, the leftist anti-fascism of the 1920s and even liberal anti-fascism, as represented by somebody like Mises, and the anti-fascism of the Antifa today, or the anti-fascism of the the advocates of intersectional politics, or the anti-Trump people. They really don't have very much in common. I mean, this is their argument of a book that, except for the demonization of fascism, that, the anti-fascists of the 1920s and the present generation of anti-fascists have really very little in common. One of the things that I point out in this book is that although the present left continues to identify with Marx and Marxism, most important Marxists attacked homosexuality, expressed racist views, all of which the present generation of anti-fascists, represented by Tim Snyder, Mark Bray, and others, they typically, sort of sweep this under the rug. That leftists in the past, particularly Marxists and communists, were very homophobic, the most homophobic people in the world. But since the intersectional politics now centers on LGBT and anti-racism and feminism, what they do is they sort of read back their own eccentricities into, Marxists and communists of the past. This book on anti-fascism I've been working on for a while. The problem is that it was very hard to finish because there are new manifestations of anti-fascism every day, and you have to keep you try to update, and after a while you just give up.
Yeah, well, that's a good segue to this piece that you wrote over at Chronicles Magazine, and that's called Antifa, Nazis Without a Plan. And I have to admit, usually when you see the term Nazi thrown out in a discussion in modern politics, I'll become very skeptical immediately. But when it's yourself throwing it out there, someone who's written extensively on this issue, including your great book on fascism, I tend to listen very closely. A difference that you point out immediately that I had not thought about previously, unlike the German Nazis, Antifa not only loathe their own race and nation, but that they're doing everything possible to weaken them, which is a fascinating distinction. A lot of the articles on the similarities, this was an interesting distinction to start with. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the fact that I'm likening them to the Nazis, not to generic fascists like the Italian fascists, but certainly to the Nazis, I think requires qualification. And I think certain things are obvious, that unlike the Nazis, they actually hate their own people. I would also say they're far less rational than the Nazis, which may make them less dangerous. These people are such lunatics, that you really wonder what they would do with power, even if they were to acquire it. They certainly would not be as deliberate and as diabolical in their use of it as Hitler was. But the similarities to me are very striking. The nihilistic violence, the Antifa behave very much like the brown shirts, the Sturmabteilung with the Nazis. And if you remember, Hitler finally got rid of them in 1934. He just, and I'm thinking, what would Biden, well, Biden, of course, suffers from senile dementia, but what would the people who control him do if they can't control the streets anymore? And I think, I don't think they'd be able to kill all of them, but they would immediately suggest that these were counter-revolutionaries, they were anti-Semites, they were Nazis, they were fascists, or something like that. And then they'd move against them. Although not in the same ruthless way that Hitler dealt with the brown shirts. The other thing that's really striking about this is that, like the Nazis, but even more so, these people have enormous support system. I mean, to compare them to the communists of the 1930s or 1940s is ridiculous. I mean, how many people ever, do you doubt for a moment that if the Antifa ran somebody for president, that person wouldn't pick up millions of votes in this country? And, they have the media are behind them, mainstream media, universities, Hollywood supports them. They apologize. Members of Congress keep apologizing for them. So, these are peaceful protesters and so forth. So you cannot fail to recognize that just as the Nazis enjoyed a tremendous support system among German nationalists who mistook their intentions and thought that, that they could really be used by them, and they would, create restore Germany's greatness, get rid of the Treaty of Versailles, and so forth. These people enjoy a very large support system. I would also say it's much more irrational than the people who support it. It's even crazier. I had to figure this out. The other thing about this that I find extraordinary is the support that Antifa enjoys among corporate capitalists.
Mm-hmm.
This is unbelievable. I mean, it's not just George Soros. It's PepsiCo. It's all of them. It's Citibank. They're all behind Antifa. Or, they say we're behind Black Lives Matter is bad enough. But then Antifa gets mixed in, is part of the mix. And directly and indirectly, the Biden staffers, in New York ran to get Antifa leaders, out of, they get them released from prison, after they were engaging in violence and beating up people. The Democratic Party is joined to the hip with this, with Black Lives Matter and with Antifa. So, this is very similar to the way the Nazis were able to create an enormous support system in Germany before they took power in January of 1933.
You mentioned that the incarnations of Antifa have they keep reinventing themselves. It's hard to keep up with the newest one. Was there a chapter, or I don't know if that's the right term, was there a segment of Antifa here in the United States at some point that you would consider intellectuals that were actually into real Marxism?
No, I think these people were only Marxist frauds. I think they're about violence, hating white Christian males, stuff like, even though many of the members are white Christian males, I don't see that many blacks. They're mostly white Christian males who are members of this. And some white women, that the Marxism is almost a kind of shadow now. Like, you get some of these Antifa sympathizers like Keith Ellison in Minnesota, who, by the way, won in an election. The majority of Minnesotans and overwhelmingly white Minnesotans voted for this guy. He's a big Antifa fan. He occasionally mentions Marx, but, I don't think he's that intellectual. And his ties are mostly with the Nation of Islam. Being Marxist would require too much of an intellectual effort among these people. Mark Bray likes to pose as a Marxist, the one who wrote the Antifa handbook. But if you read him, he knows nothing about Marxism. It's sort of a joke. It's like, the relationship of Hitler to Nietzsche or Schopenhauer or something. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just a kind of silly gesture.
You mentioned in the article also something that's been frustrating me is, as someone myself who sympathizes with some legitimate schools of anarchy, the bastardized use that Antifa has, calling themselves anarchists, and they actually have no coherent vision of any form of anarchist society, correct?
Yeah, Keith Preston, who is sort of a right-wing anarchist, and writes about this, says he has yet to discover any anarchism in these people. One of the things that he and I are both amused by is the way people say, I totally reject the system. I am a Marxist. I'm a radical. And they, run around with Biden buttons on. Or, the Hillary Clinton. I mean, if you were a Marxist, why would you be doing any of these things? Most people who call themselves Marxists, whom I know, support LGBT politics and, would slit their wrists for the Democratic Party. I do not take their Marxism very seriously.
The defenders of Antifa, I've noticed too, I don't know if this was a talking point handed down, but it seemed like now all of a sudden everyone that defends them is saying, look, they're not a formal organization. It's just an idea. It's just a philosophy. All of us are Antifa. What is the deal with that?
Well, they are, in fact, these sort of organizations that come together every now and then. They sort of agglutinate. They're a conglomeration of regional groups. But to say that they do not form a whole, a cohesive whole of some kind is ridiculous. I mean, there's, I'm sure if we look at the Ku Klux Klan when they were much of an organ, they probably had different branches in different places. I think that, but in the case of Antifa, they try to give this appearance of being very loosely organized because, then you cannot say that they're being supported by a single donor or that they're a collective organizational force. And they're trying to give the appearance of spontaneity, but they do meet as groups. I mean, there's records of them meeting as groups. And they seem to do the same things. They look the same way. They put on the same black mask. They appear at certain places at the same time, even if they claim to belong to different Antifa organizations. And we could all assume they're getting money from George Soros. They probably have shared donors.
Let me tell you about a sponsor for today's episode, and that is Zippix Toothpicks. I can't stop with these things. When someone wants to sponsor your podcast and you already use their product, it's going to be a good time. I love Zippix Toothpicks. Remember the toothpicks as a child you would get with the cinnamon flavor? Well, these are like that, but a lot better. These are the adult version of those. Lots of good flavors and 2 milligrams of nicotine in each toothpick. How good is that? They've got the peppermint watermelon. That's my favorite. They've got a whiskey flavor, a clove flavor, and they're all very affordable. Well, since they want to support this show, and since you listen to this show, you're going to get 10% off with promo code DTTP at checkout. So now you've got no excuse. When you're out and about at dinner and you've got that craving afterwards, don't get up and be rude and leave the people sitting there wondering where you're going. Sit there with your Zippix toothpick. They taste amazing, your breath will smell good, and you've got that great nicotine buzz that you're looking for. I love these Zippix toothpicks. They were started by pharmacists, and I can't say enough about them. Honestly, I use them all day long. I love them. Join the numerous smokers who have tried everything and found Zippix as the most effective, affordable nicotine substitute available. It's especially affordable since you love the Death to Tyrants podcast, because you, my friends, will get 10% off. Go to zippixtoothpicks.com. That's Zippix, toothpicks.com. Enter code DTTP at checkout. Get 10% off. You'll thank me later, and then I'll say, no, thank you for supporting Zippix and this podcast. I almost hate to ask something that seems this absurd, but I keep seeing it, and so I might as well bring it up because I know some of my listeners get frustrated with this. There's this claim that I will call by generic leftist will say that Antifa, they're just fighting off the Nazi enemy just like the Greatest Generation did. I've seen memes with photos of pictures of United States soldiers in World War II claiming that these are just the original Antifa. Can you please speak some truth to that claim?
I can't be truth. It's utter nonsense. What can I say? No, I think one of the problems that Antifa has, and you see this in Mark Bray, who is their sort of leading spokesman, and there's another one whose name just eludes me right now, but Keith Preston has written on him. And he always shows up writing in sort of left-wing Zionist things, attacking right-wing anti-Semitism. They let him write for these magazines. Is they always claim to be fighting Nazis. And it's the same thing as, we were fighting Hitler's armies in World War II. The problem is there aren't any Nazis around. And you might find, a few of them in their grandmother's basements writing something, until they get deplatformed by Twitter. But the reality is that, the reality is the right is dead as far as I can see. I don't see much of a right of any kind. I mean, never mind Nazis. I don't find very much pushback. Where are these neo-Confederates? They hardly exist. I think what the major problem being faced by Antifa, Black Lives Matter, the media, leftist academics is obviously a pleonasm because almost all academics are crazy leftists, as we know. And that's true. The problem is they have to keep inventing an enemy because there isn't any enemy. They have so thoroughly defeated and routed any kind of opposition in a way that's really frightening to me. there isn't any up. There's so what they have to do is say, really Trump is a Nazi. James Clyburn, right, the congressman from South Carolina, he's a Nazi, or Mitch McConnell is a white nationalist anti-Semite or something like this. They have to keep creating an enemy that is not there, because they've been able to basically make opposition go away. I think this is a frightening thing that, no one is really standing in their way, least of all the conservative movement. They were the last people on earth who are going to stand in their way.
The other group you mentioned briefly that's always aligned with Antifa is BLM. Have you studied them at all? Because there is some, I've heard some people that I trust out there saying that movement, at least at the organizational level, is rooted in Marxism. Is that true?
Yeah. The Black Lives Matter do pay at least lip service to Marxism. And you also get some blacks in it, who had Marxist associations, or in the case of Angela Davis, was a self-avowed Marxist and a student, as I was, of Marcuse. So, at least in the older, or you get younger people who say they're Marxist, but have no idea what Marxism means. But you do find some acknowledgement or avowal of Marxist beliefs in Black Lives Matter. They're also a racist organization. I mean, they combine black racism with at least, one might say, ritualistic Marxism. They claim to be Marxist or socialist, and a commitment to violence, which I think they also associate with Marxism.
Do you think that there's a white leftist elite that basically are using blacks as a means to an end?
I believe that entirely. I say that in my book on anti-fascism. I think it is controlled by white elites. I think blacks are just being used. By the way, I find it amusing when I'm attacked as a white nationalist, when I think whites are the problem. Blacks are being used by the whites. This is the white elites, have their own end game. And I think the end game is basically to weaken and destroy other whites whom they hate. Christians, gun owners, traditional whites living in small, a lot of it is just utter contempt. The white elites are also globalist. They do not believe in nation states. They'd like to create some kind of, and also certain things they say are in their are in their economic interest. Like, if you don't want to hire blacks to work for you, what you do is you say, we'll all take a knee when they play the Star-Spangled Banner. Or we are going to, you don't have many women working for you, so, you have transgendered bathrooms or something as a gesture. But I think there's a white corporate elite. There are people in the deep state. There are others who are using this. And I think they're all hoping that once they take power, the violence will end, or they'll just have to end the violence. I don't think blacks get anything out of this. Although they seem to hate Republicans, they think they're racist. They support utterly corrupt black politicians who are allied to the white left. They're allowing themselves, I don't feel sorry for them. They allow themselves to be used. I mean, their behavior is just stupid and contemptible. But, they're not running the show any more than Muslims are running the show in Europe. Someone like Merkel was delighted to have Muslims come into Germany. For one thing, she hates her own country. But, there is a white globalist elite that wants to destroy traditional nations, traditional societies. And the blacks are not in charge. I don't think the blacks are very much power within this elite.
I want to ask you something about the culture wars that are going on right now. And I would be curious on how you would frame the sides. Because, I know you're going to say that, and I agree with you, that the left has basically won the culture war. But does there seem to still be a culture war going on at some level in this country?
Yeah, I think there is. I think a lot of the Trump supporters are culturally conservative, culturally traditional. I live in a small town. It's largely German Protestant, a lot of German Anabaptists settled here. They do not know very much about politics, but they want their guns. They're believing Christians, most of them, and they absolutely hate the elites, and the elites hate them. So we've pretty much lost the right-wing intelligentsia. I mean, maybe they exist at Chronicles Magazine, and I'm already 78, so I'm not going to last much longer. But we do have lots of Americans, more than Western Europeans, I would think, who are going to stand their ground. One of the things, though, that absolutely appalled me was the lack of pushback among Southern whites when they're being humiliated by Republicans as well as Democrats. You think they would be defending their statues, their grave sites, all these other things. No, you can spit all over them. They don't seem to care. I do not understand this. But I don't think you could get away with that kind of stuff where I live. There is a very large mass of people in rural Pennsylvania, and I'm sure they can find them throughout the country, who have their own way of life, live in a kind of hunting society, are Bible readers. There are lots of Americans, and these are the ones that the white elites, are taking aim at right now. Of course, the ones who are really being destroyed, one might say, are white liberals living in cities. The white elites that thought that they were safe. I've been reading that the Upper East Side of Manhattan is being attacked by Black Lives Matter. I could not help but support Black Lives Matter in this case. But there is, I think there is in America a considerable, mostly white population. There may also be some blacks, but it's a black minority. Black policemen, black businessmen who might also, line up, and there are probably some Hispanics who do. I think the war will go on. It's going to smolder for a long time, the tensions, and it might even result, as I've argued, in areas of the country sort of slowly, perhaps even surreptitiously seceding from the central government. And this might happen even faster if Biden is elected and then put in a nursing home, and Kamala Harris or Stacey Abrams or someone like that becomes, our acting dictator in the United States. It would happen even faster. But I think some of the regions of the country are simply going to try to assert, not really assert their independence, but act in a way to defy the central government. And they might get away with it because, unlike the situation in 1861, I really don't think the central government is going to use much force at this point. I don't think Stacey Abrams or Kamala Harris will be another Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, let's hope not. So that's kind of what I was actually going to ask you. You do see a possibility of maybe a peaceful style secession at some point in the future?
Well, it will never be a full secession. I mean, I'm not to believe, but what will happen is they will assert regional independence over a long period of time, and the federal government will just let them go their own way. I would think if the country were actually to break up, it might be a good idea at this point.
Yes.
I'm not a big secessionist, but I think the cultural division goes so deep, and the differences are entirely irreconcilable. And we're not going to be united by believing in Harry Jaffe's view of universal rights or a global democracy or some other neocon nonsense. I think these are deep cultural differences, and the central government is certainly not going to, or the media will not bring these people together.
Right. I want to ask you about Tucker Carlson. He's got, from what I've heard, the highest rated cable news show in history. He said some things I had never thought I would hear on Fox News ever. What are your thoughts on him, and does he represent at all an ally for paleos?
He's not our ally. I mean, he does have some of the people who write from Chronicles on his show. He never had me on, and I'm, pretty old and not going to be around that much longer. He has no paleo-conservatives of my generation whom he allows onto his show, and most of the people he has are on the left, or homosexual Republicans or leftist homosexuals who have now declared themselves to be Republicans. He might have very right-wing instincts, but I think he is hemmed in by his sponsors. And when he attacked Heritage Foundation and what's her name, Nikki Haley and some other people for kissing up to the far left on the race question, sponsors immediately canceled, or withdrew from any kind of relationship with the show. So I think he has to be very careful. A lot of what he says, I think, is utter nonsense. That, America was founded on equality, and we all believe in equality, and this is I don't, this seems to be a kind of vulgarized Jaffaism or something. As far as I know, we were founded on a constitution, and there was a kind of Northern European Protestant culture that was behind this or something. The adoration of equality came much later. He also has made statements that, if we allow black nationalism to flourish, then we'll have white nationalism. Well, he must know this is nonsense. I mean, the white nationalists have been totally eradicated by now. All you're going to get is black nationalism. And not everybody has the same rights to group self-assertion, right? If white males don't have the same right as, let's say, black lesbians or something like that. I mean, this whole notion of diversity politics, is based on a pecking order in which white male Christians are at the very bottom. He knows these things. He's not a fool. But, I think he is afraid of being associated with groups as far to the right as paleos.
Do you see a resurgence at all in paleo-type ideas right now? Like, does the populist right resemble anything that you would consider fellow travelers?
Oh, yeah. No, I think the paleo ideas are all over the place. The problem is we do not have the money, the resources that are available to Con Inc. and the neocons, who are now united. And they have studiously kept us off, out of the media. They blacklisted us while building alliances with the left center. Anyone on the left will talk to them, as I point out in the vanishing tradition. As I said, the only way we're going to get into the club is by breaking down the door. That's how you get in, because they never let us in. There was a piece actually that struck me. It was a National Review, that the real enemy is the right. The dark right or something. And they're not talking about white nationalists. It's like anyone to the right of themselves. The left is not their enemy. There's people whom they're going to try to persuade to be their friends. So the paleos are going to have to fight hard. They may have to hide some of their views. They may have to dissemble. For all I know, Tucker Carlson may be dissembling. But I'm always running into paleo ideas. And I would say even a lot of people who work for Con Inc. websites and journals and so forth are paleo-conservatives or paleo-libertarians.
Yeah, that's an excellent segue. I was going to ask you about that. You've always been welcomed by many at the Mises Institute. I'd like to ask you, what are your thoughts on Hans-Hermann Hoppe and his Property and Freedom Society? Does he represent that old paleo-libertarian alliance to you?
Well, he's definitely a paleo-libertarian. There's no question about that. And he's very contemptuous of ideas like democracy and equality, which are still God terms for Tucker Carlson. I think he's an excellent polemicist. I enjoy listening to him in English or German. And, we've been friends for a very long time. But it is interesting that he holds these conferences in Turkey. He probably would be arrested for holding them in Germany, which is one of the least, people say Germany is the freest government the Germans have ever had. The reality is it's one of the worst. It's one of the least free governments they've had probably since the Middle Ages.
How influential was the Israeli lobby in suppressing the paleo-conservative movement?
I'm sure they had a hand in it, although I don't think, the Israeli lobby or the Zionist lobby, AIPAC, is probably, is probably not identical with the neoconservatives. I would think most people in AIPAC are politically to the left of the neoconservatives, and probably, do not want to be allied with the Republican or the right wing of the Republican Party and so forth. But there's no doubt that the critical views expressed about Israel by some paleo-conservatives were used by neoconservatives to depict them as anti-Semites. There is absolutely no indication that this is true, by the way.
Let's just say if Trump were to be reelected, would that in any way represent some kind of final nail in the coffin to the neocon movement to you?
No. You get neocons who are, appointed by Trump. Look, he had Bolton in his administration. Kudlow is a neoconservative. There are other neoconservatives working for him. You don't see any paleo-conservatives in his administration because paleos don't have much of a presence in the conservative media. They have no presence, whatever, in the conservative media. I think the neocons would have to sort of share their power with some other groups. One group that differentiates itself from the neoconservatives, who I find them actually worse, are the followers of Harry Jaffa, the West Coast Straussians. They are totally intolerant, global democratic fanatics who have managed to present themselves as the old right, while at the same time totally ostracizing and marginalizing the old right. And some of those people are working in the Trump administration. They don't like but some of the neoconservatives who broke off from others to back Trump became associated with the Claremont Institute, like Victor Davis Hanson. He's one of them. Bennett is another one, William Bennett. Podhoretz, the younger Podhoretz was as in every Trump, but the older Podhoretz supported Trump. So these people have become part of the Japhide group as well. And neoconservatives who support Trump are really, become Japhites. They become one. And they do have very much have an entree into this administration. Paleo-conservatives said, no, paleo-conservatives are going to get absolutely nothing out of Trump. And some have raised the question, it would be better if, Biden gets elected. I will vote for Trump because I find the Democrats so disgusting, so repulsive. I couldn't possibly vote for them. However, thinking in strategic terms, it wouldn't hurt to have Biden elected.
Well, in closing, I would like to hear you real quick talk about anything you have to plug, your podcast with Joseph Cotto, Chronicles Magazine, which I love, by the way. Plug away at any of that.
Well, I want everyone to subscribe to Chronicles. We lost almost half our subscribers in a period of 5 years. And I would remind listeners that in the early 1990s, we had as many subscribers as National Review. We were sort of running neck and neck with them. I always say it's like the Argentine experience. Remember, the Argentina at one time had a standard of living comparable to that of the United States. I think in the 1930s. Now they've fallen behind us economically. And I'd like to rebuild the magazine during my watch in my senior years. The other, I'd also urge everyone to read our blog. We have some great pieces there. I think you'll enjoy them. I'm trying to put on more stuff that's dealing with current events, at least on the blog. Our executive editor, Ed Welsh, sort of separates the blog from stuff we're now giving out free from the magazine, after it appears in the magazine. But the blog has a lot of good stuff on current events, just as the Chronicles Online has a lot of good material from the printed version of the magazine, or not from the version, but from the magazine itself, so to speak. So I urge everybody to subscribe to our magazine.
Excellent. I will link to that in the show notes page for this episode. Dr. Paul Gottfried, thank you so much for being with us once again.
Thank you.
All right, what a nice chat with Dr. Paul Gottfried. They are always fun chats when I get him on this show, and they always do quite well in the download numbers. So I know there's a lot of fans of Paul Gottfried's out there. Hope you guys enjoyed that. I certainly did. As for me, I got to tell you, here's where I always talk about the various places to find me online. Now there's just one, basically. It's death2tyrants.com. We got all grown up over here and got ourselves a website. And that links to my Instagram, my Facebook, my Twitter, and my Patreon page. And all of that over at death2tyrants.com. Special shout out to my sometimes co-host, the great Bobby Pearson, for all of the help. He did the whole damn thing, Bobby did. So if you like the website, that's your man. He did an awesome job. So thank you, Bobby. And you heard me mention Patreon right there. I do have a Patreon page that you can contribute to the show at, and it's patreon.com/death2tyrants. And we've been putting these little episodes out just for the Patreon supporters. The rest of you guys haven't been hearing them. They've been a lot of fun. I've been doing them with the aforementioned Bobby Pearson as my co-host. And after this show right here that you're listening to right this second is over, we will play you a clip of the latest exclusive Patreon donor episode of the Death to Tyrants podcast. So you'll hear my little theme music here, the theme that you guys ask me about constantly. I looked on Google the other day. It's a Google search, Death to Tyrants podcast intro, or Death to Tyrants podcast music. So keep writing me and I'll inform you of what that song is. Anyway, after you hear that song right now, you will hear a clip from the latest Patreon donors exclusive episode of the Death to Tyrants podcast. Thank you guys so much for being here once again. Welcome again to all the new listeners, and I will talk to you guys soon. Have a good one.
You get split in fucking half, till I call the hologram wrath. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com. One thing I would ask Jesse Dayton now is, interestingly enough, a day or two after you just wrote this long post crying about libertarians and where are we defending the leftists in these battles against the police and the feds, and that's a broader picture. He basically did a micro version of what I'm saying here, but where are we? And just 2 days later, we found out at least where one of them was. He was there with them, and he lost his life in a battle. And again, I don't know if he was in the right, if the shooter was in the right. I don't know any of that. But I do know he was a libertarian, he was armed, and he's gone. And so I would ask you, Jesse, where were you? You're a gun guy. This means a lot to you. Why weren't you down there like that libertarian was? And on that note, Bobby, did you have fun?
Yeah, that was a mic drop outro there. I just got chills.